Yeah, I'll go ahead and get my screen shared while I'm talking. So I have quite a bit of experience with the WHEP program, Wildlife Habitat Education Program. That's one of the things I'll talk about today. I competed in that program as a high school student. At that time, it was only open to 4-H. And now it's open to FFA as well. Also competed in the Envirothon. And now, as the Extension Wildlife Specialist for Kansas, I'm in charge of WHEP for our state. I host a state contest every year, and then I'm also a member of the national committee for that program. It's mostly Extension Wildlife Specialists from around the country that have developed that program, and so that's one of the things I do. When Shane asked me to do this, I happily agreed, and I'm excited to be here and talk to you all today. One of the things, though, I think that I want to make sure that you know is I haven't had any real experience with delivering these curricula, at regular 4-H meetings and that sort of thing. I've been more on the side of running the contests that come from some of these events, and also as a competitor when I was in high school. And so if I say stuff that doesn't make sense in terms of delivering curriculum at your meetings, you're welcome to tell me that, or you can just ignore it. But that just will show that I don't have a lot of experience with that side of it. Mostly I deal hands-on with stakeholders around the state that either want to promote wildlife or that are dealing with wildlife damage. This picture on that title slide is a group of kids that were competing in our state WHEP contest. That would have been the last one before the pandemic hit, when we were actually able to do it in person last, but that was here in Manhattan. And I'll talk about that some more in a little bit. So sort of the structure of what I'm going to present will be talking about some different resources that are available to you. I wasn't for sure if this was going to be mostly just extension agents or if there were going to be some volunteers that were looking at this stuff. So some of this may be redundant because I am going to talk about some things that are on the KSRE bookstore. So I'm going to go through this set of resources that I think can be valuable. And then I'm going to pitch 3 or 4 ideas for hands-on projects that I think would work well for 4-Hers to do. And some of that is based on things that I've seen when I was judging projects at the state fair and at local fairs and those sorts of things. And I think they're things that some of them are really inexpensive, and I think they're things that could be implemented pretty well. So that's sort of the structure. Shane, are there any questions before I go on? Or are you ready for me to just get into it?
Nope, you're good. And I'll monitor the chat to see if anyone adds anything in.
Yep. Perfect. Sounds great. And please, nobody feel bad about interrupting me. I'm happy to have a dialogue as we go along here rather than waiting until the end for questions. So if we're thinking about curricula and project ideas, I want to make sure that everybody knows that we have some of this stuff available on the KSRE bookstore. So there is a really good tracking. It's called a wildlife challenge, I guess, but on here, the agents that worked on this give several ideas, and we'll go over this in more detail later. But if you're struggling to find ideas for 4-H projects, that's really good. And then this description of the wildlife project gives a lot of quick ideas that you can explore in more depth too. And then if you were to scroll further down on that page that I took a screenshot of, there's a bird list. There's a document that describes how 4-Hers might go about doing a bird watching project and that sort of thing. So there's some really good resources there. If we're thinking about actual curricula that could be delivered over a period of time, here is the one I believe that Shane is going to be drawing for today. So this is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. There are several levels that are designed for 4-Hers or students who are, anywhere from, I think, 3 to 5 years old on some of these, all the way up to junior high and high school age kids. So a lot of this is teaching the principles of wildlife conservation and understanding how wildlife interact with habitats and their environment and those sorts of things. I don't have any personal experience with this one. There are also some very good similar products available from Purdue Extension. So they've got wildlife science level 1, 2, and 3, and then they've also got facilitators guides for those. And so, if you're struggling with learning or knowing how to teach some of these topics or principles in an effective way, some of these facilitators guides might be really valuable. My guess is, like I said, I don't have any experience directly with these manuals or curricula, but I would guess that they also have some suggestions for projects that could be done that fit. Texas A&M has a good website, not from the curriculum standpoint, but as I was perusing this, I saw several things that I thought could be very valuable for folks who are trying to teach really anything about wildlife to youngsters all the way up through high school age and maybe even some early college age stuff. But here's a educator's resource to Texas mammal skulls and skins. That a lot of the information in there would be the information that we would teach in a introductory mammalogy lab at the college level. It contains some really good stuff. If you're thinking about fish, there are fish ID activities and lots of other things, a wildlife ID guide. Some of the species that they have in Texas and some of these guides might not be the same that you would find in Kansas, but there are some really good resources on these. I pointed out 3 or 4, counting K-State, different states' resources that are available. But, the more you search and the more you look, the more you're going to find this sort of stuff out there. And a lot of the different state websites have suggestions for different projects that 4-Hers could do. So don't ever discount the value or forget to do the Google searches for just 4-H wildlife project ideas or curricula. Those are the 2 searches I found. I did, and I found all those things just really quickly that way. So the curriculum that I do know a lot about and that I have had a lot of involvement with is the Wildlife Habitat Education Program. We call it WHEP. Anytime you get into wildlife, whether it's government agencies or learning about evaluating habitat and all those things, there's lots of acronyms. So WHEP is one of those acronyms, and it stands for Wildlife Habitat Education Program. It's got a long history. It started out back in the 70s as the Tennessee Wildlife Judging Contest. Then it expanded to a regional contest, and their first national contest was held in 1989 when I was 10 years old. So it's been around a long time. Just after that first national contest, they developed a WHEP manual that at that time probably wasn't as much of a curriculum as it is now, but now it's very much a wildlife education and wildlife habitat management curriculum that's really pretty good. So at that time, the national program was called the 4-H Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Program, and that's what I learned it as. So if you hear me say evaluation program instead of education program, that's where that's coming from. It's what it used to be. Then in 2010, they started allowing FFA teams to compete. When I competed in this back in the 90s, I was actually doing all the learning in FFA classes, and then we had to join 4-H. I hadn't been a part of 4-H before, but we had to join 4-H to compete in the national contest because we won the state contest. So that was kind of an interesting thing. But now FFA teams are allowed to compete. And in 2010, when they did that, they really wanted to make sure that it was understood that this WHEP manual is really a curriculum. It's not all about the contest. It's about learning wildlife management based on limiting factors, basically. So this is and I'm biased, but I feel like it's a really good resource. I teach a university level class on wildlife habitat management, and the WHEP manual itself it includes a lot of the material that I teach in those introductory lectures. And so it's a super good introductory text on wildlife management. On that WHEP page, which I'll show you in a minute, there are lots of additional resources. So if you were to click on the study here link there in sort of the center of the screen down there on the right, you would find a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about on this slide. There's flashcards for wildlife ID, flashcard for food items for different wildlife species. There's flashcards for different wildlife management equipment. And then there's instructor resources too, to help teach folks how to teach all this stuff. And, you know, we teach a lot of different things, but not everybody has had wildlife management classes during their educational career and may not know how to teach some of these things. So there's lots of really, really good resources on that website. And one of the cool things about this is it's all free. If you want print copies of the things, yeah, you can pay for them. But any of the links on here, you can click and get PDF documents that are free of charge. So if we were to click on there towards that top pane over relatively close to the right side, we see National WHEP Manual. So if you click on that manual, you're going to get access to a 250-page PDF document that's basically, like I said, a textbook on wildlife management. It includes information about the contest, which we'll talk about a little bit, lots of wildlife management concepts and terms, describes the different ecoregions of the U.S. There are good descriptions of the different wildlife species and their requirements from a habitat standpoint, and then also descriptions of wildlife management practices and what species those are appropriate for in different regions of the country. And then there's a glossary with definitions, of course, and then an appendix that explains a lot of the different things that are relied on throughout that manual. So, like I said, this is a curriculum. You don't have to compete in the contest in order to use it, but it is something that you could spend the year preparing 4-Hers for, or if you're involved with FFA or even not involved with FFA, but involved with high school kids, you could be teaching them this stuff with the idea that you're preparing them for the contest, and then they could compete in that contest. So there are 2 individual activities. One is the Wildlife Challenge. That's going to be wildlife ID from not just photos, but if we're at the national contest, they also will have lots of bird calls and those sorts of things. You also need good general knowledge about wildlife and wildlife management. It's all comes from the manual, and then images for identification of equipment. And then also there will be some specimens or study skins of wildlife and their food there too. The next individual activity would be the wildlife management practices. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, but the student down there in the bottom left-hand picture, they basically have a matrix in front of them that includes the wildlife management practices, all of the practices that are discussed in the book. It has a list of species across the top, and they have to evaluate that piece of property and decide which of those practices that they've already learned are appropriate for that species are actually appropriate at the site. Then there are team activities, and the team activity is a written wildlife management plan. So they're going to be given a separate area, a separate scenario, and a separate list of species. And as a group, they're going to be asked to evaluate the habitat and provide a management plan that would improve habitat for all those species, and also accommodate other things that are in the scenario, like maybe the landowner's intent to continue grazing cattle on an area or something like that. That plan that they develop has to include drawings and a justification for why they did those things. And then the last part of the team contest, that it's given individually, but it counts toward the team score, is an oral defense of that wildlife management plan. So we're trying to develop public speaking skills, and also we're making sure that there aren't any free riders on the management plan or that group activity. We're making sure that everybody who participated actually understands what they did. So we'll just take a sort of a quick overview of some of the information that's in that WHEP manual that's pretty valuable. When we're managing wildlife habitat, what we're basically doing is using disturbance to manipulate successional processes. So succession, of course, is that process of going from bare ground to the climax community for the area, which in a lot of Kansas might be oak hickory timber, or even like a cottonwood savanna. And this book revolves around understanding succession, understanding how to set back or speed up or maintain succession in order to achieve the desired habitat that's going to help the critter that you're interested in, or group of critters. So that's what basically underlies everything. Depending on where you are in the country, of course, there's different ecosystems, and we've got ecoregions. So some of those ecosystems are broadly grouped together. And if you were to win the state contest and go on to the national contest, it's going to be probably in one of these different ecoregions. And this allows effective studying. So we can study based on ecoregion if we're just using this as a curriculum. You know, we're learning eastern deciduous forest and what works there and what species are important there versus tallgrass prairie versus intermountain regions and that sort of thing. And then we can also split that up for the contest as well. So here in Kansas, a lot of the region that we're in is the Great Plains grasslands. And of course, the majority of that's in Kansas is either tallgrass or mixed grass prairie. So this is what the beginning of that section would look like. We get a physical description of what's here. We get a description of the dominant vegetation and features in the area that are important. We also get warnings like planting of trees for wildlife in this ecoregion is only recommended where trees would have occurred historically. So, you know, just because we want deer in the area doesn't mean we're going to teach folks that they should plant oak trees out in the middle of the prairie, which is an important thing from a wildlife management standpoint. And I think it's good that that's included in this. Also, it's going to talk a lot about the important land use practices in the area, how that affects wildlife, and how we can manage for wildlife within that system, the plant successional processes. And then down there at the bottom right, you see the list of species that are included in this manual for that ecoregion. So I talked about the wildlife management practices. So for each species, it's going to tell what practices are appropriate for that species. And we've got this matrix that shows that as well. And so during the contest, a student would be given a blank form like this without all those X's, and a smattering of those species, usually 6 or 8 that are shown there across the top, given a scenario about what the landowner's goals are, and they would have to look at the place, decide which of these practices make sense for each species based on the current conditions. So, you know, you wouldn't recommend livestock management for a dick sissel if there wasn't any grazing area on the property and that sort of thing. Or you also have to look and see, you know, let's say we're thinking about something like planting trees. Just because we're managing for mourning dove on an area doesn't mean we need to plant trees. There might be enough already. And so there's lots of hands-on evaluation and thinking about what needs to be done based on current conditions. The wildlife information in this manual is pretty thorough. for how many species there are, and you know, thinking about 4-Hers or high school students learning this stuff. You know, for each species that occurs in the ecoregion that we're focusing on, they would need to know all this information. They need to know what wildlife management practices are appropriate for a widgeon or for a coyote. They would need to know what the habitat requirements are for that critter, what their diet is composed of, and all those sorts of things. So lots of really good information just from a curriculum standpoint. Also lots of interesting and good information that the competitors learn and have to apply. And, you know, if you wanted to develop something locally as a wildlife project, the 4-Hers wouldn't have to compete in the contest. You could have them as practice exercises for whatever you wanted to do. You could have them evaluate a piece of property, develop a plan, select the practices, and all those sorts of things. Also, really good descriptions of what the different practices are, why they're important, and what they do. So, you know, if we're thinking about some of the population management practices, a student or a 4-Her would need to know, if we're talking about a farm pond, we would give them a description of what the seining samples reveal about the population. So if there's no young bass, there's lots of intermediate bluegill in poor condition and no recent hatch of bluegill, then you might need to decrease bass harvest and those sorts of things. So there's constantly lots of evaluation and application of the information going on. And then, you know, that group activity where they're developing a management plan and with drawings and broader scenarios and all those sorts of things, it just takes this to a whole nother level, because now we don't even have a list of practices that are potentially available for that area. The students have to know all that stuff on their own. So I think it's a really good curriculum, and it's pretty cool to see the students or 4-Hers that are involved in this and how much they enjoy being out in the field, do it and everything. Before I jump to the different suggestions that I have for projects, actual hands-on projects, does anybody have any questions about WHEP or the curriculum stuff that I talked about?
Again, feel free, if you want to unmute, you can just ask questions directly too.
Well, I'll jump into the next group of stuff and just stop me if something comes up. So this wildlife tracking challenge, or the tracking wildlife challenge, was developed, you know, to give ideas for projects, hands-on projects that 4-Hers could do. And I did a little bit of editing on this, but I basically contributed nothing to all of this information. And I think it's pretty awesome what was put together, but it's put together in a way that describes things that are very basic, that somebody that's just getting into this, you know, a first-year wildlife project participant could do, all the way up to really advanced things. So that's one of the things that I think is really cool about it. It's also got this cool component of going out and making casts of tracks. This is something that I did as a kid through Boy Scouts and different things, but I think it's kind of a lost art. There's not very many people that do this anymore. And it's just kind of a fun thing to have 4-Hers or students do. You get them outside and you learn something, you identify a track, and then you get a plaster mold of a track that you get to take home. So I think that's a really cool component of this. If you want to take it further, they give you recommendations on how to make a tracking plate, or they call it a footprint tunnel. This is something that wildlife researchers like me actually use for real research projects that we're going to publish. And so I think it's pretty cool that they included this. But basically, they describe how to attract raccoons to these small tunnels, or excuse me, attract wildlife to these small tunnels, get them to walk through ink and then leave their footprints. But this you can just follow what's in this document, or we can take it a whole lot further, right? If maybe this is an activity that you do at one meeting, but if this is something that a 4-H'er is going to do for a more elaborate project that goes on for a longer period of time, we can go out and we can document the different wildlife sign that we see in different places, with different habitat conditions, record the species that we documented in each area just from those tracks or from SCAT too. And this is a book that I'd recommend if you're going to do anything with mammal sign, tracks, or SCAT. This is the book that if I don't know what something is, this is what I go to. And the thing that I really like about it is it has real pictures in it. It's not drawings of tracks. It's real pictures of tracks. It's real pictures of SCAT that have, things, objects of known size for scale and all those sorts of things. So if this is something that I was going to do on a regular basis with 4-H'ers or anybody else, I would spend the $25 on this book, because it's a really good investment. So if you do that, go out, walk some trails. It could be along a beach at a lake. Maybe it's along a path at a park where there is some mud from time to time, or sand that would be a good substrate for footprints and that sort of thing. And along a cattle trail out in the prairie after a rain. So now we've got 3 different types of habitat. One of them is in an urban environment, one's a prairie again, and one's at a lake. And then record the species you encounter at each place. And then you can actually test hypotheses if you want to, or maybe not think about it as a hypothesis testing exercise about habitat selection, but you could think about human impact. So are there certain species that are more commonly encountered at a park, and are there certain species that are more commonly encountered just out in the prairie, and those sorts of things? So we're getting at, does human disturbance bother them? And you could get a lot of growth out of the 4-H'ers doing that project. I think it'd be a really good learning experience and be something that they get a lot out of, and could develop some really cool, educational displays and that sort of thing if they wanted to. A lot of what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this time, where I'm introducing things that might be projects, that's sort of taking it to the next level. Is you can go out and encounter wildlife, and you can make a list, and that's a great way to get started. And maybe by the time they're in their 3rd or 4th year in the wildlife project, then we start developing lists of different species at different places with different conditions, and thinking about why that might be. So bird watching, like I said earlier, there are some resources on the KSRE bookstore that would be good for this. There's a species list, there are some guides, and then there's also a guide about how to go about setting up a project that's looking at bird ID. There's also some really good apps. The NGOs around birding are huge, and they get lots of support because there are lots of people that are really passionate about birding. And so the bird ID apps are really good. University professors are oftentimes involved in helping develop them, and they're pretty advanced, and that sort of thing. So one really good bird ID app that's associated with eBird is called Merlin, and Then there's another one called Autobahn, and they are both very rigorous. And one of the cool things about these resources is if you allow them to use your location, or if you designate your location in the app broadly, like I'm in Kansas or I'm in the Flint Hills of Kansas, then the lists of potential species start to get narrowed down. And they also get narrowed down by the time of the year. And then you can start doing things like saying, you know, I'm in this sort of habitat, I'm looking at this color of bird, and you can start narrowing things down, and you can make that identification process a lot easier. Some of the birding apps also will play bird sounds for you and help you learn to ID bird sounds while you're out in the field. So you can play a sound that you're hearing and say, yeah, that matches. No, that doesn't. Let's go try something else. So I think that's a really cool technology tool that, as long as you have a phone or an iPad or some kind of device, then a lot of these tools are free, and they can really get us over that learning curve on how to ID birds that could jumpstart somebody in this sort of thing, and also take away some of the stress or take away some of the learning curve for the leaders or whoever's helping this 4-H'er. Because, you know, I'm a wildlife biologist, but it's been a long time since I took ornithology, and there's a lot of these species of birds that I don't look at every day. And so I use these same resources too to identify stuff, and I think they're pretty valuable. One of the things that I thought of as I was looking at the old paper lists of species and that sort of thing that are suggested for recording what a 4-H'er sees is incorporating eBird into that wildlife project. So let's say you have a 4-H'er that is going to watch a bird feeder for this many hours, this many days a week during this season. If they use eBird, they can pick their location, and then you're going to say more of a fine-tune area of where you birded. I think I actually had a duplicate slide in there, so sorry about that. You're going to say your date and how much time you spent doing that, and then it's going to collect that information for you. And so it will compile your species lists, and also the locations where you bird, and those species lists that are even potential species are going to be tailored to the area where you're at. So it reduces the number of mistakes that you can make. And so now we have this permanent record that we don't accidentally lose, that we can also then compile by location. And so it provides a way to organize the data that these 4-H'ers might be collecting when they're doing these projects in a way that you can sort of manipulate afterwards. So here's an example. I'm not an avid eBirder, but you know, my PhD advisor was a birder, and he was an ornithologist, and I was seeing some birds when I was out doing my mammal research and coming back and telling him, and he told me, you need to be putting this stuff into eBird. So if you can, I can go all the way back to 2013 and see what birds I saw where, and think about those sorts of things. The other thing that I think is cool, really cool about eBird is now we've taken some 4-H'ers around Kansas who are doing birding projects, and when we start putting it in eBird, now it becomes part of a data set that is citizen science that scientists around the world are using as a resource to understand bird habitat relationships, or the impact that people have on birds in different ecosystems, and lots of different things. Phenology, meaning, when birds arrive at certain areas along their migration paths. And so now we've taken one 4-H'ers project that they might do for 3 years and get a whole lot out of. And now we're doubling up on that. We're sort of double dipping and turning it into data that other folks can use too. So I think it's kind of a cool deal. So if we think about a bird watching project, one thing that you could do, and you know, if it's the first time that a 4-H'er has worked with birds, or if it's their first year in the wildlife project, maybe they create a simple list of yard birds. And this could be with a bird feeder to attract the birds to a spot, or maybe it's just the birds that they see in their yard. And you know, the best way to do this would be to standardize the time that they're watching, you know, watch this many hours, this many times a week, and maybe do it during different seasons of the year and that sort of thing. So that is something that's valuable, and that would make a good educational display. But now let's think about doing the same thing that we did with the wildlife tracks. So now we've got a list of birds that are encountered at a park in town, a list of birds that might be encountered at a lake, in a prairie, at a pond. And we start comparing the species that we see at those different locations. So here's me doing this with my son after COVID started, and he needed to do this kind of stuff for high school science, or for junior high science. And he had to test hypotheses. And so one of the things that he was interested in testing was, what's the impact of towns on bird communities? And so his hypothesis was that there would be more wildlife species present in town, or excuse me, more bird species present in town than we saw out at the reservoir. And kind of one of the interesting things about that we found was, you know, there were actually more species in town. It was just, there were more species in town. We picked up species in town that like to be around people. And so he got to test a hypothesis. He got to think about habitat selection and that sort of thing. So if we include different habitats when we're doing stuff like this, it adds a cool layer. And again, if you've got an electronic device, that's going to help you a lot with identification. And then if you use eBird to record things, then you've got that digital copy stored on a big server somewhere that's not ever going to go away of what you did. And if you name your sites, so let's say we've got a park, I live in Council Grove, so the park is Council Grove. And then John's Farm, that's going to be the prairie site, and the reservoir. Every time I go back to those sites, it's going to have a list from that site. And so then later on, I can go back in and compile the species that I saw under those habitat conditions and compare, and not have to do a bunch of, you know, fiddling around with a notebook and that sort of thing. So I think that could be pretty cool. Another thing that we did for that same project was just some real basic fish sampling. And I'm not sure, I'm learning how to use Keynote, and I clearly haven't figured out the animations part appropriately yet, because things aren't coming in the way that I thought that they were going to. But you know, we seined 2 different sites with different characteristics. We seined the river, the Neosho River that comes through town, and then we seined the reservoir, which is actually part of the same water system, but very different conditions. You wouldn't have to do both. You could make a 4-H project out of just going out with the net, or even hook and line sampling, determining what fish you catch and identifying, and that could be its own project, right? That's maybe coming into the sport fishing side of things a little bit, but doesn't have to be. I mean, we didn't catch any sport fish in the Seine. We caught all non-game fish. But then if you sample under different conditions, then you can compare the species and look at differences in different conditions. And, you know, a seine is another one of those things. You can go to Walmart or a bait shop and get a seine pretty cheaply, or a dip net even, and that sort of thing. So the last thing that I thought I would mention, and this one's a little bit more expensive, but a lot of folks nowadays, if they have family members who hunt, are going to have cameras, going to have trail cameras. And so those trail cameras may not be used during the summertime or during the spring, if the person who has them is mostly a deer hunter. And that is a super valuable tool that if we're wanting to do a wildlife project, we can go place that trail camera out and collect the data card off of it, swap it out maybe once every couple of weeks, and look at the different species of wildlife that show up on those pictures. So you're identifying and keeping a list. And then if we deploy them in different habitat conditions, again, we can do that exact same thing that I've been talking about, making it more and more and more advanced as that 4-H'er or that student learns more, and develops more skills and maybe gets more questions and those sorts of things. So this is all my contact info. Anybody is welcome to reach out to me with questions about anything at any time. Doesn't have to be 4-H or wildlife project related, but happy to answer anything about wildlife that might come up. And I'm also happy to sit here and answer questions and have a discussion about the 4-H wildlife project as long as everybody wants to.
So there was one question from Vicky. She asked a little bit about application for insects of some of the materials. Vicky, do you want to maybe expand on that question a bit?
Well, I was curious if there's any things in there of things we could study or lists of insects in different types of habitats, things like that, that we can apply it to the entomology project.
You know, I don't know what would be in the curricula, but the same sorts of things that I'm talking about, you could do that same sort of sampling. If you've got a sweep net, go out and sweep net in the prairie, go out and sweep net in a wheat field, and go out and sweep net in a fescue or a brome patch, and identify the species in those different habitat types. And then, you know, you can ask the same sorts of questions. What species are going to be in which habitats? Maybe what species are going to be negatively impacted by certain types of agriculture or developments and those sorts of things. And insects, there are really good guides for identifying insects. There's also an app, a phone app called Seek, SEEK, by iNaturalist. If you give that access to your phone and or excuse me, to your camera on your phone, and hold it at different distances to the critter that you're trying to identify, or I use it a lot for plant identification when I encounter a plant that I don't know. It's not 100% accurate all the time, but it's pretty doggone close. I found that it's really good. And so if you don't have a list of potential species to go off of, there are resources like that that can help you identify the critters that are out there that you're catching, whether they're insects, or if you get a really good bird picture, it can also identify pictures sometimes. So that'd be my suggestion. If you're thinking about doing something like that with insects, and insects or wildlife, I just left them off of this because we've got a whole separate section for entomology. But when we start thinking about the ecology side of insects, then it's more of a wildlife question probably.
What other questions do we have? Again, you can put those in the chat or you can unmute at any time.
Hey Shane, I have a question. Snakes, reptiles. Do you have any resources on snakes? Because I have a 13-year-old. She likes snakes.
Yeah, there are some really good herp guides out there that you can buy. One of them is through the KU Museum of Natural History. There is also the Kansas Herp Atlas, which is a website that has real pictures of all of our native species of lizards, snakes, reptiles, and amphibians. So that's a good resource. And from a sampling side of things, if somebody wanted to do a project where they were sampling, there are several ways you could go about it. One would be to go out and flip rocks. So during the growing season, basically, so from like May through now, most of those snakes and things would be active, and so we can flip rocks. The important thing about that is you need to learn how to do it in a safe way, so that you're not exposing yourself to potentially being bit by a venomous snake if there are some around. Would also probably want to make sure that somebody who knows how to identify snakes well is there, because the vast majority, or not the vast majority, more than 50% of the people who are bitten by venomous snakes every year were actually handling the snake. And most of that comes from people handling snakes that they misidentified. And so when we're dealing with youngsters that may or may not know the ID, that's an important thing. So flipping rocks would be one thing. Another way would be to put out cover boards. So if we had some plywood or even some old metal siding or something like that, we can place cover boards and then come back and check and see what's under them from time to time.
Okay, or 10.
Another possibility would be to put out some pitfall traps. You would want to be able to monitor those on a regular basis. But if we're thinking about lizards, you can put up some metal flashing on two sides, bury a bucket in between them, and when the critters hit that metal flashing, they're going to follow it. And if there's a bucket waiting at the end, they're going to drop down into that. And as long as you're checking them about every day, then you can ID the critters that are in there and turn them loose. You're probably also going to catch some small mammals in that sort of a design, so shrews and mice and that sort of thing. Another cool thing you could do with snakes is just drive back roads. You would want to drive for like either a set distance or a set amount of time at a certain speed, which should give you a set distance, right?
Right.
The best roads to focus on would be when it's warm and then we start having cool evenings. This time of the year, snakes really are attracted to those blacktop roads that are retaining the heat from the daytime. And so in spring, after the snakes emerge, and then this time of the year, especially right before they start going to hibernate, if you drive those blacktop roads, you can encounter a lot of snakes, and you could develop a list that way too. And if you put your routes, let's say along some prairie and in a cropland dominated area and through a woodland, then you could take it that step further where we're doing some habitat selection type stuff and that sort of thing.
I have a question.
Sure.
My kids are very involved with the shooting sports project, and they do hunt deer and everything, but they also, in the off season, they love to just explore our pastures and find drop antlers and stuff. And so just trying to teach them more, I guess, is there some of your curriculum that would help? I mean, is that involved with the wildlife, or should that stay in the shooting sports project? Or is there much crossover? What would be your recommendations?
I think that could be good wildlife project material. We just have to figure out, you know, what's the purpose? You know, I think when it's important to, and this comes from looking at projects that I've evaluated at the state fair, at county fairs, but I think it's good to keep in mind what the purpose was. When I see a poster that's describing a fishing trip, then clearly that person learned something, but it may just be keeping a record of something that they were going to do anyway, right? But if I see a record of species that we caught in different types of water, or if we went out trying to decide what was where and those sorts of things, then there's a purpose to it. And so if you're thinking about shed hunting, you could, if you do it across a number of years, you could try and collect matching sets. You could try and collect sheds from the same buck over a number of years and have a record of that. I saw a really cool poster, or not poster, but educational display this year at the state fair, where a 4-H'er had deer jaw bones that were actually correctly aged, that were on the display, and it was describing the aging process for deer. It had pictures of the body changes that occur and how you can age deer based on body shape and those sorts of things. And, you know, a collection of shed antlers could fall into something like that too. You could also, while they're doing that, have them write down things that they encounter while they're out there on a regular basis. So just basically documenting, and this is going back to the stuff that we've talked about, but if they're already going out, document what tracks you see every time you go out, or scat, you know, using the sign example, or write down the different species of birds that you see on those sorts of trips, and that sort of thing. So I think you can double down on a lot of this stuff.
Thank you.
Yep. And then I guess the other thing that you could do is, if you wanted to create an educational display about shed antlers, we could have this collection of shed antlers and then talk about, you know, what happens to them after they're shed. That becomes a resource that rodents take advantage of to get the calcium out of them, and lots of different things. So, you know, when they're shed and people don't pick them up, other critters take advantage of them too. And that's part of the ecosystem and part of wildlife. And that might be a cool thing for them to do too.
All right, as you're thinking about your next question, again, it's really nice when we have an expert with us that we can ask these things. I'm going to share, I did draw for 10 winners of the wildlife conservation curriculum. And so the reason I picked this piece specifically, and we'll be sending these out, I guess tomorrow, actually, after all this is wrapped up. So the reason I picked this one, these are very hands-on form to function curricula pieces. So you'll be getting 3 sets. There's an intro. And so we were asking about activities. In each one of these books, there's content, and then there's examples, and you'll see these when you get it, of actual activities you can do and then experiments you can do. So it gives you a step-by-step of how you create a wildlife diorama. If you're going to make wildlife connections and talk about habitats and different interactions in the food chain and the food web display. So one thing that hopefully you'll get when you actually dive into this is there's not only content, but then some simple ways that you can actually provide action to those pieces when you're working with your kids. All right, we've got time for a couple more questions. The other piece, the other one that Drew brought up was actually the National 4-H Wildlife Science one. That's also a very good piece. Part of the reason you're not getting this one for the people who drew is this one's only available as a digital download. So that's one thing that I wanted for everyone that's taking part in the in-person pieces. They would have something tangible to use. This has a lot of great activities as well. It's a bit more on the wildlife science component, like it says. It's not solely on the conservation side. Like the other piece is more form to function and does focus mostly on conservation. Okay, if there are no other questions, Drew, we've got about 2 minutes. Anything else you want to kind of wrap up, share with the group?
Well, I really enjoy getting to judge the projects that folks put together, and you know, that's kind of my way of getting to interact with all this stuff. So that's kind of a cool piece for me. And then I really want to grow the WHEP program in Kansas. So if, you know, if there are any 4-H leaders that need any resources for that or need some help getting started, I'm very happy to work with y'all on that for sure. The state contest is every spring. Usually it's in the beginning of May because we have to try and avoid Envirothon and state track and state FFA and all those sorts of things. But that's something that goes out on the ag agents listserv every year. And like I said, I'd be glad to help any way I can to get folks started on that want to.
So that's a good reminder for everyone that's watching this recording or live. All of our presenters that we've had, whether they're either from somewhere local or even in another state, have made it really clear that if you have questions or want additional help, to reach out. We have all their contact information is on the site for them. So if you now know Drew, you've had a chance to get to meet him. He's a great resource. So I would encourage you, if you have questions, to reach out to any of our speakers from these sessions. They'd be more than willing to help connect you, or reach out to me and I'll help make the connection for you.